All right. Hi there. My name is Sean Seckinger. I am a occupational therapy student with the University of St. Augustine. I'm going to be performing the map of SCRAPS quick visual function screen. This is my patient. Firstly, I'd like you to start. We're going to do a mobility screen. So I'd like you to get up and I'd like you to walk to the end of the hall and then come back as comfortably as you can.
Oh, really?
Very good. So I noticed when you were navigating the room, I saw that you bumped into a few objects, and I also noticed that you were moving quite slowly. So what I'd like to recommend is that before you navigate a room, do a scan of the room. Make sure to take in the obstacles and have an idea of what is in your path before you navigate the room, which will increase your safety. Next thing I'd like you to do is I'd like you to read this. Tell me what you see.
Sean.
All right, now I'd like you to read that word on the wall over there.
Pilot.
Very good. Now, what I noticed is that you had a little bit of trouble with your far vision acuity. What I'd like you to do in the future is we're going to use greater font, and we're also going to use a contrasted color so that it makes it easier for you to notice the changes in words, and it makes it easier for you to pick up on those things. And we can grade the activity by bringing the word in closer and then moving it out farther to make it more difficult. Now, next thing I'd like to do is I'm going to do a pupil reflex test. So if you could look at my finger. All right. Good. Now I noticed that you had a little bit of trouble with your pupils dilating at the correct speed and accommodation. So what I'd like to recommend is for future interventions that when you enter from a dark room into a lighter room, try and read a word, just one word, at a moderately large font, and that would help to increase the pupillary reflex, increase the strength in your ocular motor. So next thing I'd like to do is we're going to assess one vision or diplopia concerns. So I'd like you to focus on this object and tell me what you see.
Sean.
All right.
On a board.
All right. And then I'd like you to focus on that bottle on the wall. All right. Now I noticed that you had some problems with far vision acuity when related to double vision. So one thing I'd like to recommend is that when you focus on the larger word across the way, that we're going to use a brighter color and a contrasted color to make it easier for you to pick up on those visual cues. And we're going to start at a closer distance. And I'd like you to really focus on that object while it's closer, and then we're going to grade it by moving it farther and farther away. That way we increase that neural signal, and you can decrease the amount of diplopia that you have. Next thing that we're going to be assessing is the saccades. So what I'd like you to do is I'm going to hold up my fingers. All right, and I'd like you to look at the finger that moves, and we're going to alternate between them, okay?
Okay.
All right, ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Good. All right, so I noticed that there was a bit of a delay in her saccade movement. So what I'd like to recommend is that I'm going to slow down the prompts. I'm going to make the time between the differences slower, and then I'd like to also recommend that we use contrasted colors between the two objects so that your eyes can pick up those visual cues a lot easier and make the responses times quicker. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to test convergence. So I'd like you to focus on my finger, and I'm going to bring it in closer to your nose, and I'd like you to tell me when your vision goes double.
Okay.
All right?
Mm-hmm. Now.
Good. Now I noticed that there was a bit of delay, that we got in a little bit farther away than she should have. It should be about 3 to 4 inches from her nose. So what I'd like to recommend is that at home that you read a large print font at varying distances and color contrasts in order to increase your ability to pick up on those convergence. Next thing we're going to be assessing is your range of motion. So what I'd like you to do is I'm going to use my finger, and I'd like you to focus on it as I move it in various directions, okay? Very good. Now one thing I noticed is that during the range of motion that there was a deviation at a certain point during the range of motion. So my recommendation is going to be for the client to use bright colors and contrasted colors in order to further visual cue the client, as well as using verbal cues. Cue the client to look upwards and to the right, or downwards and to the left, in order to tie in those other neuronal pathways and utilize different cueing in order to stimulate those neural pathways. Now, nextly, we're going to be performing an accommodation test. So I'd like you to, as before, I'd like you to focus on the can right there. And then I'd like you to focus on the bottle on the wall. Now the can, now the bottle, now the can, the bottle, and then once more the can, and finally the bottle. Very good. Now I noticed that there was a delay when she focused on far objects, and that can have an issue when focusing on far objects, especially when driving or community mobility. So one of the things I like to recommend is once again using bright and contrasted colors in order to stimulate and to provide additional additional visual stimuli. And then what we're going to do is I want to prompt the client to focus on the object at a closer distance, especially because far distance is a deficit. And then we're going to move that further and further away in order to grade the object or grade the task up. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do a pursuit task. So I'm going to be performing an H test and an X visual tracking test. So I'd like you to focus on my finger, and I want you to follow it. Very good. Now I noticed that there was a bit of deviation, that there was a bit of trouble, especially when tracking in the X pattern. So that would speak to a deficit in ability to pursuit, and would affect her ability to scan for objects, especially when participating in shopping or when searching for objects in her closet during dressing activities. So one thing I like to recommend is that when performing these interventions, I'm going to prompt the client to remain seated and to use a bright or a contrasted color object in order to ease their tracking ability, and then I'm going to grade it with speed instead of at a moderate speed at first. Slow the speed down and then increase in order to grade the task up. Finally, we're going to do a spatial relations task. So I'm going to draw a series of X's on a board, and then I'd like you to replicate that on a piece of paper. All right, now I'll get you a piece of paper.
I'm supposed to do in the same pattern.
Yep, same pattern.
Okay. Can I look at it? Can I look at it?
Very good. Now I noticed that the client had a bit of issue with translating the initial task to a replication, and that would speak to a spatial relations problem. This would especially translate to issues with navigating in a room or navigating in the community. So what I'd like to recommend, especially if there is a spatial relations with navigation, is like before, when you enter into a room, I'd like you to take a minute to take in the obstacles within the room. Make sure that you're taking those in and have a good mental picture of where those obstacles are, so that there is a increased ability or increased chance of you navigating safely and increasing your independence when participating in functional mobility and community mobility. So that concludes the map of SCRAPS visual screening test. I'm Sean Seckinger. Thank you.